for the session with Bas Losekoot. We're very, very happy to have Bas with us today. And he's going to be talking about his extended project out of place. And I'm going to hold up a copy. I can't actually see myself in the galleries, which is not necessarily a problem. I'm going to see if I can go back. No, I'm not there. So I'm just assuming that this is roughly in focus. So he's going to talk about this body of work, which is frankly quite remarkable. It's a great plug for a fantastic book. If you get a chance to buy it, get it. It's wonderful. It's quite wonderful. The photography is fantastic, and I'm very happy to have been involved in an extended conversation with Bas as well about his work, about how he conceptualizes his approaches to photographing in the street, some of the kind of issues around ethics, some of the issues around cinematography and the idea of a kind of an unfolding landscape and being within a kind of a narrative rather than sort of imposing a narrative, sort of discovering a narrative as well. So this idea of detouring is quite central. I'm going to say just a few words. Bas is an artist and photographer whose work addresses socio-cultural issues in cities around the world. He uses cinematographic apparatus and techniques to challenge the understanding of everyday urban realities, as well as the limited narrative potential of documentary photography's representations of truth. His practices combine concepts of sociology, urbanism, and film theory. Once in the street, he visualizes the experience in modern megacities with an intuitive eyes. The rest gives us quite a lot of information about his background, but Bas will probably tell us a little bit more about that. So I'd like to join me in welcoming Bas Losekoot. Thank you.
Thank you. Great for being here, and thanks, Paul, for organizing this, and also Mercedes, thanks for organizing all these events. It feels great to be part of this great collection of artists of the Photoland Talks. I'm happy that you were. I actually was going to do this lecture 2 weeks ago, but I was diagnosed with Corona. So it wasn't going so well with me 2 weeks ago, but now I feel much better. I'm still a little bit foggy in the brain sometimes, and I get really tired sometimes. But if I fall asleep, you're gonna wake me up. No, it's gonna be great. I'm at my studio in Amsterdam, let me start by talking about the project. It was in 2007 when I first read about the idea of the urban millennium, and that was the time in history when there were more people living in cities than in the rural countryside. And this really made me think about how the cities were going to change and how this population density was going to affect human behavior, actually. And I wanted to explore this on a global level. The project started in 2011, so it's already like a long time ago, actually, where I created a sort of blueprint, a sort of methodology to work in other cities, and I really wanted to research this this theme on a global level. So by 2018, I photographed in 9 different cities. I worked in Sao Paulo, in Seoul, in Mumbai, Hong Kong, London, Lagos, and Istanbul, and the last city was in Mexico. In most of those cities, I worked for 1 month, where I walked the streets every day in the morning till late in the night. From this project, there's a book published that Paul already announced. I actually want to show you and explain you a little bit about the book later on, where I can actually show you the physical book. But now I like to show you the photographs of the book, and I'm going to show you to them not in a chronological way, also not in a geographical way, but in the edit of the book. I thought this was an interesting idea. The book sequence is made by me together with the designer of the book, Teun van der Heijden. The book is published by Keder Verlag. It's a German book publisher. So actually it's a German book, but I am from Amsterdam now. So now I'm going to show you the photographs. I'm going to share the screen now. Probably I'm going to disappear and I'm not be able to see you anymore. We're going to have a break around 10 for 9. Later on we have question and answer. So feel free to ask questions in the chat, or also you can raise your hands and ask a question. And it's a seminar, so it's also a little bit about you. If you have questions, please speak up. So now I'm going to share the
quickly
screen.
say for those tuning in from the UK, we'll be breaking at 10 to 8. If you want to listen here, because it's a different time zone.
Sorry, yeah, completely right.
And there are people from other places as well.
Yeah, that's true. So you are seeing my screen at the moment, I think. You're seeing my screen, right, Paul? You can see everything, right? Yeah. All right. So there we go. I show you first a couple of pictures, and then I will elaborate on some key concepts of it. By the way, there's a pipeline above my head where there's water dripping out. So if you hear something dripping, it's not me, it's the pipeline. I hope we're gonna keep everything dry here. So I wanted to stop on this photograph, because when I started to work on this project, I had some really big questions actually when I started to photograph here. I thought, like, what is really the promise of the cities? Big cities always have been considered to be places for a better future and unlimited possibilities. But what really is the promise of the city that is attracting a lot of people towards it? City governments also make decisions in the name of the so-called progress. And I find this word progress really interesting, because what does progress really means on a human level for the inhabitants of the city? And in the end, I mean, it's a really big question, but is the growth of megacities providing a fundament for human happiness? And back then I started to read into a lot of the subject matter. For example, by the sociology of George Simmel. He already described the modern city life as a struggle in his book, The Metropolis and Mental Life, where he says that it's decisive that city life has transformed the struggle with nature for livelihood into an interhuman struggle for gain, where here is not granted by nature, but by other men. And I started to read, for example, in the book of Desmond Morris, that he wrote a book, it's called The Human Zoo, where he says that life in a metropolis is the modern equivalent of how pre-urban people fought against nature. Where we previously had to run for our lives, we now have to run for our jobs. So we are not running from life-threatening danger, but from the threat of exclusion. The struggle for survival remains the same. So I started to photograph a lot of people, and actually the people that have to realize this so-called progress. So I was starting to focus on people that working in financial districts, but also places where a lot of people come together. So for example, the entrance of shopping malls or subway stations. And also places where the so-called progress is literally in the making, where close to construction sites, for example, where people have to walk in a different way, and they get a little bit out of the normal routine. And those are really actually places where I took a lot of photographs. I wanted to, one of the key themes in the work is the idea of proximity. I wanted to focus on body language, gestures, facial expressions, momentary eye contact, and so on. And I asked myself, how do we deal with all the information and stimuli that we have to process every day? And how do we deal with the large amount of strangers that we are confronted by every day? And I really started to see the city centers of cities as a pressure cooker for human expression and development. I really got interested in the physical and psychological distance between people, and how do we present ourselves on the streets? And do we really reveal who we are, or are we maybe hiding something from each other? So I wanted to photograph this in a sort of, actually in a very intimate way in the public space. And this photograph really reminded me of the theory of Henri Lefebvre. I spoke with Paul as well, and it's such an interesting book, where the book of rhythm analysis. And I got interested in the patterns of human behavior and the rhythms of urban life. And Lefebvre really describes how analyzing the rhythm of the city is really a bodily experience. And for example, when I was working in Sao Paulo, I was photographing, and after, at the end of the day, I was taking the subway. I was going down, and we were walking down with a lot of people. And inside of the tunnel, I started to focus on the footsteps, on the sounds of the footsteps. And I actually started to realize that the footsteps were starting to be walking in sync. And then suddenly I felt I was becoming part of a group, and it actually made a sort of sound that really reminded me, like, how would you say, like the belly of the beast, you know. It was something sort of a sound from the abdomen of the city. And so to really think like this, you know, it made me think like we are becoming like a flock of stirlings that you see in the sky. So I found this murmuration a very interesting thing. It made me really aware of the patterns that we can discover in urban life. And it made me realize that photography in the urban space is all about observation. And if you really study people, if you stand still for a long time on the street, you really start to recognize certain patterns in people's behavior. You really see that people are walking out of the office one day, they go to the left, next day they're gonna do probably the same thing. The way people touch their hair, the moment when they grab the telephone. So if you really study people, like I would say, like a bird watcher, then you can really predict somebody's behavior, and then you know when to be on time with your camera. And this is something that in the beginning of the project I did a workshop with Alex Webb, which is one of the great urban or street photographers I think that we have. And I discussed my work with him, and a very interesting idea is his idea of this pre-visualization. So to be aware and to recognize certain human behavior and small little things, you are going to be ready with the camera on the right time. There is a strange notion of togetherness in my photographs. I photograph people that are on the move and they're in transit. And when commuting, we get to deal with so many people that we can do nothing else than to shut ourselves off. There's so much information. There's so many strangers that we cannot do anything else but hiding. And to understand this sort of fear for the stranger, I had to rethink the concept of public togetherness that Richard Sennett is really beautifully describing in his book. He describes the idea that we desire to belong to a group. However, at the same time, we seem to avoid contact with the same group. Engagement with strangers rarely happens because of the challenges and insecurities that come with it. We could get hurt or disappointed, or we might get involved in a long conversation that we don't have the time for. Therefore, often the stranger remains unknown. And this was very interesting to me. And I thought that maybe we want to be part of a group, but at the same time, we also want to be an individual. We like to be together, but we don't want to be the same. And this is what I think you really see in my photographs, that we are maybe alone together. The anonymity of the man in the crowd is a very important part of the metropolitan experience. And it was, again, already George Simmel already like he wrote already in 1903 that one nowhere feels as lonely and lost as in the metropolitan crowd. So, for example, in the place where I live in Amsterdam, I was really shocked by the fact that 1 on the 8 inhabitants of Amsterdam really confessed that they are extremely lonely. And this really made me think, like, how can we live together in such a high, densely populated city and still feel really isolated from each other? And I think London was already in 2018. I think they assigned a minister of loneliness. London was like the loneliness capital of Europe, where they consider loneliness to be as dangerous as smoking, for example. So there's a highly death rate in it, and that's there was a sort of economical imperative. So people started to take care about it, which is interesting. The working title of the project was Private Lives in Public Places. And I actually always liked this title. It was almost going to be the title of the book, but it always reminds me of this. When I walk on the city, I usually think about this sentence that was wrote by Sartre, was saying, hell is other people, which reminded me that we're always living in a society based on trust. But in this trust society, there's a lot of fear and anxiety towards the stranger. So I found it very interesting that within certain boundaries, it is allowed to watch and observe, to look at things in public that are actually very private. And what I was saying before, it seems like we are sort of hiding for each other. I find this an interesting idea. And I think by the use of telephones, sunglasses, earplugs, that is the perfect way to really hide from each other. And the iPhone or the mobile phone became a very important instrument to really navigate urban space. So that is really interesting, that we are living in an age of technological connection, but at the same time, a social disconnection. And yeah, it seems that we live in a personal bubble where we are physically present but mentally absent. This photograph I made in New York, quite in the beginning of the project, and I was attracted to this sort of void, you know, a place where you can really don't recognize anything where you are and when you are there. And when we are commuting, we are in a sort of state of transit, and I discovered that as a sort of a state of being in between. And this in-between-ness is maybe connecting to this idea that we are performing certain roles. So when we leave the house, we go from the role from the father to the teacher to the worker to the businessman. So we actually are in a state of in-between. And that's why I was thinking to the notion of liminality. We are in places where you don't really know where you are anymore. And I think that Marc Auger, he really described these places as a sort of non-places. And also other people, for example, Rem Koolhaas, he wrote a book on the generic city, where he states that maybe in the future, all cities will become like a sort of airports. And that in the end, probably we may be what he describes as become bridge and tunnel people, so that we actually move from one place to another place, from bridges to tunnels. And this is something that I discovered for example, in Hong Kong when I was working there. You can move through Hong Kong, especially in the old side of town, going through shopping malls, and you take an escalator and you go underneath the floor, and you don't, after a while, you don't actually know if you are on street level or where the street level actually is. And you take an escalator and suddenly you're high up above the floor. And this, yeah, really made me think about the vertical city. And Hong Kong is very vertical because it's built upon a hill. But for example, when I was working in Sao Paulo, I was really shocked by the amount of helicopters that you see in the city. And that really sort of kickstarted my fantasy. I have to say that I'm very heavily influenced also by science fiction movies, where you see really beautiful images of this vertical city, right? So I started to think about this. Maybe in the future there's going to be a sort of rich and powerful elite that lives on the top floor of all the high rises, and that they move from building to building by helicopter and by bridges between those buildings. So yeah, so actually I have a lot of these photographs that are close to this liminal spaces, and it made me think about it and realize that this project is not really about the city. It takes place in the city. And if you would say the project is more about space than it's about place. Yeah, this photograph is always very special to me. It's made in Lagos, Nigeria, and let's say Lagos is maybe the one of the most difficult places I photographed in. At the same time, it's also one of the most interesting places I photographed in. And this photograph, when I first, let's say the place is a sort of flyover. There was a van standing there and it was completely burned down. So the ceiling of this flyover was completely covered in ashes. And I was attracted to the fact that when people walked underneath it, they start to go smaller and smaller and smaller. And I found that a very interesting situation, and it does something with the human scale. And so I was photographing there. And you have to realize that Lagos, you cannot really work alone. As soon as you take the camera out on the street, people are going to come up to you. They want to help you. They want to make some money on you as well. And this place was really, I was attracting a lot of attention, and there was a lot of bystanders, and people start to be a little bit too curious, and people started to be a little bit drunk at the end of the day as well. So there was a sort of threatening situation. And I think this photograph really emphasizes that. You see these very tall figures, blurry and out of focus, walking really straight up to you. And I remember the first time when I look at this picture, I thought like it's not a good picture because the focus is more on the people on the right, while I thought the focus should be more on the two guys in the front. But actually, I think this blurred people in the foreground really create a lot of depth in the photograph, and yeah, it really connected to this sort of feeling of anxiety that I was feeling at that moment. This one was made in New York, and I would say there are three kinds of different images in the project. I have these wide-angle shots, for example, this one, and those are really about what I would say the human scale, you know, like the scale of the city in relation to the people that are on it. I also have these medium angle shots, I would say like a 50 millimeters, for example, where and there's usually two people involved, and those images are really how people relate to each other. And then I also have these very close-ups in this project, and those close-ups, they are really the people that I photographed there. They become really the protagonists of the story, if I would say, or sort of they become a sort of archetype of the city. I get really close to the skin there, and it's, for me, it's almost like you look at those people and you see the city through their eyes. So in the beginning of the project, I was shooting more these wide-angle shots, and later on, I really got really closer to the people. So you could say that there's like, I would say like a shifting paradigm, going from more the architectural towards the more sociological approach. I spend a lot of time figuring out what the cinematic might be. How come an image has a cinematic quality to it? And I have to say that in all these photographs that you see right now, I used artificial light. So I have these small flashlights that I put on tripods or that I put into traffic lights or in trees or anything that I could find. And I do that because I really feel that these flashlights, they empower the quality of photography to really freeze movement. And I think photography already does that. I mean, because of the shutter speed, photography can really stop motion, but I think the flashlight really emphasized that. And I'm also attracted by this idea that by this technique of flashlights, I can photograph something that is that you're unable to see with the naked eye in the normal speed of light. So I was also inspired by the photographs of Edward Muybridge, for example, these chrono photographs where he photographs the horse that is almost flying over the floor. So yeah, as a young photographer, I was trained in a classical photography studio. And then I studied in Den Haag at the Art Academy, where I was gravitating more to the moving image as well. Then I studied after graduating at the art school in photography. I did a film course at the Dutch film school, where I studied cinematography. And I also started to work in the cinema, where I was the projectionist. And this was the place where I got really fascinated by the single film frame. So this frame that is, there are 24 frames in a second. And I started to cut out these little film frames and I took them home as well. But I got fascinated by the single film frame and how much information is in there. Later on, my first jobs as a photographer was to be a stills photographer on film set. And as you maybe know, if you're working on a film set, there's a lot of waiting. I mean, you're there for 14 or 16 hours, and then you have to be ready to shoot this one single photograph in 10 seconds. So you have a lot of time to talk to people. And I really think that I was also influenced by cinematic light, because yeah, to see how film sets are lit. And I had a lot of time to talk with the gaffers and electricians to study that. So later on, let's say like 10 years ago, I really started to be interested in urban space. And I decided to take the lights that I was used to work with in the studio, take them outside of the streets, and then the urban space and the streets become like one big studio. And it made me think about light, and also about what we call the Paul and I discussed that in the afterword on the book, which is called the truth of light. Because what is natural light? For me, my use of light that I use in these photographs is inspired by these double light situations. When you go into a place where there's a lot of high rises, a lot of glass buildings, you see the light bouncing between those buildings. So actually you don't even know where the sun is and which light is direct sunlight or reflected sunlight. And this was really for me the inspiration to work with. And I started to create this kind of double light situations. So is it natural light? I don't know. I would say it is natural for the scene there. But yeah, for example, when I come back after 1 month of photographing in a city, I would print all the photographs out and I would show them to gaffers and cinematographers and discussing with them what felt naturally and when I would go over the top. As you might know that in film, that gaffers and cinematographers are always afraid to overlit a situation, you know, like good lighting is usually, or often, it's about not lighting, you know. So yeah, but in the end, I think, you know, this light really, I started to use it really as a sort of metaphor for capitalism almost, you know. It felt like the light was the best in places where you might expect it to be. So yeah, I mean, we talked about when the personal becomes the political. I think this really connected there for me. This photograph is made in Mumbai. It's actually the last photograph that I took in the project. I was done in 2018, but I was working with some architects on a book in Mumbai, so I had the chance to go back to Mumbai, where I shot this photograph. Yeah, a lot of people ask me, like, after you photographed all those cities, what did you learn? What is the conclusion? And is the growth of these megacities providing a fundament for human happiness? And are we creating these ideal cities by making the city so big? And yeah, in response to this, I can only refer to the words of Hugo MacDonald. This is the writer that wrote the wonderful essay in the beginning of my book, which is called The Paradox of Living in the City, where he asks the question, what does it mean to be human in the city? I'd like to read a little piece on it. I don't know how far, yeah, we have some time. Living in the city is to accept a life of paradox. We are physically squashed, but emotionally distant. We are sick of people, but we are extremely lonely. We have everything at our fingertips, but it's never enough. We battle constantly to maintain a balance between our public and our private lives. Externally, we are strong and determined, but internally, we are fragile and weak. We smile gently and close our eyes in the metro in quiet resilience, but inside, we are screaming. And maybe these are some situations that we might recognize, that we probably have all this sort of love-hate affair with the city. So yeah, he asked the question, what does it mean to be human in the city? And it means learning how to preserve oneself within the mass. It means learning to adjust from human to cog and back again. In effect, it is mastering the art of leading a double life. And this is the last photograph of the book, but I wanted to end on this photograph also because it's the cover of the book. So yeah, what do I bring to the street, and why do I do it, and what do I like to achieve with this project? And those are some very difficult questions to answer, but I really realized that I photographed these people, the isolated, the lonely people, because actually I feel extremely close to them. I recognize myself in them. I could be them, you know, walking, stressing in the morning, and don't look around so much anymore. And I would say this project could be really a call or a plea for more social and open cities, where we become more engaged with our fellow urban dwellers. An encounter with a stranger might be an interesting opportunity or an exciting friendship. By sharing experiences in real life rather than online, we can transform the street into a more human environment where people look at each other instead of at their mobile phones. And a small gesture can mean a lot to a stranger. Driven by curiosity, these urban encounters, no matter how small or modest, can help us overcome our fear for the unknown. So yeah, I hope with this project, and I really think that good photography or good art projects really can do that. It can lead to a sort of cultural awareness that can lead to a better understanding of social, political, economical, historical issues. And maybe in the end, finally, sort of facilitate changing. But by working in all those cities, I hope that this body of work is holding up a mirror to society, and that it makes people think about the meaning of living in these dense urban places. How are we doing on time? Okay. The book came out, I think 3 months ago, and there was a wonderful article in the Guardian. And yeah, when I read this, I realized that this is really the place where I wanted the project to be. Is it time to rethink the city? And I mean, this is really the debate that I want the project to be. And I know this is also relating to the pandemic where we are in right now. And I have to say, when I wanted to publish this photo book, it was already finished like 2 months ago, before the pandemic. Actually, the book had a lot of delays. I can tell you all about it later. To create it, to make a book is a lot of hassle. Takes a lot of time, money, and energy. So the book was ready, and the pandemic came. And then I started to realize, like, this book is about like densely populated places. And this is really not the case anymore, because all the streets are empty. So this is really not the right timing to release this book. And yeah, it was only later on where I realized that we live in a time of uncertainty and a lot of fear, and we don't know where things are going. And then I realized that these anxieties are there. Those feelings we can recognize in the faces of the people that are photographed. And I think we have to rethink the city as well. That the city, we can talk about a lot about this in the Q&A, I think, because we're all thinking about it. Especially myself is thinking about it, like, is the city still the ideal place to live in? Where do we really belong? And do we still want to be in the city when the city is not an attractive place anymore, when all the cinemas and museums are closed? So, and also this idea of personal space, you know, like, how do we deal with personal space as we live now in a sort of 1.5 meter society, you know, and how do we deal with that? So I think the photographs really connect to this time of the pandemic, and I really think that because of this pandemic, the whole city is into a sort of like it's been into pause mode, you know, like everything has come to a standstill. So and this is really what I try to achieve with my photographs. I think using these high shutter speeds and flashlights, I was really able to really capture and to freeze this movement, and that really connects to the time that we live in right now, I think. So yeah, I want to show you the physical book as well. I have a couple of shots of it that actually I'm going to show you the book in reality, because there is something special about it. I go out of the sharing screen mode, if I can do it. Stop sharing. Everybody still there? Yeah. So it's getting dark as well a little bit, but I think we can still see see most of it. I'm going to turn out the light in a bit. So the book, we can do a whole lecture about bookmaking. It's something that is very interesting. But the book has something special to it. There are some sort of layers into the book. The things that I showed you right before we started. There is when you have a photograph like this, we deal with certain different formats of paper. So when you see a photograph like this, there is a sort of opening to it. And if you open that, you go to the next page, and then suddenly you see 3 different cities all together. So you have one in the top and one on the side, and the photograph in the middle. And you can open it, and you go to another to the next photograph. And this we have done because we want to emphasize, we want to add literally another layer. So you really go sort of in depth. You go from one story to another and divide the whole book in some sort of episodes. And this layering, we also wanted to bring to the cover of the book. So when you have the cover like this, there is a dust jacket around it. And usually I don't like dust jackets so much because they fall off. But in this way, we use it in a sort of conceptual way. So we really, if you like, we go through the crowd, and the crowd unfolds, and we come to the individual. And this is what I really like. For the rest, what we did, we treated the book as a sort of, we wanted to give it a sort of cinematographical experience. So we start in black. So the first pages in the book are black, and the essay of Hugo is done on silver ink on black pages. And from there you start the photographic sequence to end finally in the conversation that me and Paul had in the back, and that is printed on white. So this is really the moment when you come out of the cinema and come back into the real world. Actually, in the middle, there's 3 mini film scripts. I asked a scriptwriter to respond to my photographs, and I asked him, "Can you write 1 minute of film script based on a photograph or a character in one of those photographs?" So I worked together with Casper van Beek, who is a young scriptwriter, film producer, and also an author of thrillers. And he wrote these film scripts that are very, very abstract, and I really like the way he did it. And it's really, for him, it's really difficult to create an interesting story on 1 page of film script, because 1 page of film script is corresponding to 1 minute of film, and that's what I really like. That for 1 minute you really dive into the head of one of the persons in the story.